You're welcome back. This is Newsfile, it's your most authoritative news analysis platform. And here on Newsfile, we put Ghana first. It's not been that easy getting the first part of this show over. It's been a difficult production, beginning sometime in the afternoon throughout to late in the night. The calls and the messages, and I'm like, whoa, one matter that is going to be discussed. All right, now let's welcome our guests for the second part, as in the domestic debt exchange program. Bryce Simmons is Honorary Vice President Imani Africa. He joins us via Zoom. So is Godfred A. Bokping, Professor of Finance and Economist, University of Ghana. Dr. John Ampuntua Kuma, MP Ejiso, and Deputy Finance Minister. We have Felix Kwakye Ofosu, former Deputy Communications Minister and NDC parliamentary candidate for the Ebura Aseibu Kwamad Kese. He's right here in the studio. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your patience. Thanks for joining us in studio.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Great. So first, let me start with you, Bright Simmons. We have been reading the articles, well researched as always, that you have authored as far as this matter is concerned. You and Dr. Theo Echampong believe that the numbers as posted by the finance minister are looking rather magical as far as the success rate of over 80% of subscription to the program is concerned. What's the concern really?
Make a quick presentation to provide some backdrop to the comments that we've been making so far.
Hello, Bright.
Yes, can you hear me?
Because we have like just about less than an hour. Is it possible to hear you in the next maybe 5 to 8 minutes? You know, bring us the jugular as regards the real concern about the numbers.
Yes, I'll try and be very brief.
Okay, please go ahead.
Okay, so I don't know if the screen is responding on your side. Are you able to see my screen?
Right. Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, so the key point is that in Ghana, we have debt of. First of all, we have to be very clear that when we talk about the debt in Ghana, we are not only talking about the securities, the debt that you can buy and sell, which is the bonds, the treasury bills, and the rest. We have other types of debts like the loans, the overdrafts, etc., etc. And if you add all of that together, it's way in excess of 250 billion a day. With the government's servicing of debt covers all of this. So when we are looking at the securities, the bonds that, and remember, we are not even at this stage touching the treasury bills. We're only doing the bonds. So the servicing of the bonds is what we are talking about. But that does not mean that if you restructure the bonds alone, you are out of your problems. There are other types of debt. So that's the first point. The second point is that we've got to a point where we're spending over 70% of all the tax revenue that we generate servicing the debt. And the government in its latest release suggests that had reached almost 85%. So the whole purpose of this exercise is to spend less of our tax revenues on debt, because we are spending so much of our money on debt that unless we're able to reduce the amount we spend, the country was going to shut down. That really is why we did this debt restructuring. We also now been told that we've got to the point where every time that they announce that the government has gone to the market to raise debt, and they come up with all these impressive numbers, 3 billion has been bought or 2 billion have been bought. What we're not being told is the people buying this debt now includes the Bank of Ghana doing a big chunk of the buying. So a lot of the so-called oversubscription in treasury bill markets and the rest that we're seeing actually involved Bank of Ghana stepping in because investors were not buying enough. We didn't know all of that. So the situation was very dire. And from the depth of sustainability analysis, we're going to get to a situation where in a few years, maybe 4 years down the line, we spend more than 100% of all the money we raised paying debt. The success of this exercise is dependent on whether or not that problem has been reduced. Are we spending all our money paying debt or not? So when you look at the current situation, this is what happened. This is a red intelligence graph that shows you how much of the debt that we had, the bonds, remember that we're only now talking about the bonds, were tendered in, how much the government wanted to restructure, how much of it was accepted, and how much of it was not. Now here is the government's breakdown of how many individuals turned in old bonds to get new bonds. And the purpose of turning the old bonds to get new bonds is that the new bonds are cheaper for the government. Now, if you look carefully, you will see that the category A and B are just all individuals. The pensioners and the non-pensioners, they are all just individuals. And individuals hold about 20 billion. So from what the government got in total, about 75% of them did not do it. Then you go to the rest, which is, everybody else. And everybody else, going by the initial discussion that we had, you are talking of something in the region of about 110, 115 billion. Of that, they got 76 billion. So those are the numbers that you have to keep in mind as we get to the analysis. And the analysis is pretty simple. When the government went out to the market to do this, it wanted to tackle the bonds, not the other types of debts. So in the bonds, or among the bonds, 137 billion is what the government felt it needed to change the terms to reduce the interest rates and the pace at which it pays back the principal. And that 137 billion is your base. That's what you are trying to fix, or what we call treat. So that number is a very important number. That was in 5th December 2022. Then the government came back again, and because of all the back and forth, it realized on 7th February, almost at the end, that it needed to change the document that people were supposed to sign. Basically, the prospectus, that is the contract, the new contract with people that have the debt. And in that document, it said that the debt that is trying to deal with, the bonds, is about 130 billion. So that 130 billion becomes the new base. That's the amount of debt you are trying to fix. That's the amount of debt you can't afford to service. When the final participation then came in, when people had finally done everything on 10th of February, and then the government communicated back to us, they had reduced that number of total debt that they are trying to treat to something around 97 billion. Now, what we are saying is that these are gimmicks in a way. And it's nice to tell a good story, and it's true that this got then covered internationally. That suggested that the one had hit 85%. But the truth of the matter is that that was only because you reduced the total amount of bonds that you claim you now need to fix, or you are able to fix, which is what they call the eligible debt. So you only get the 85% if you don't use the final adjusted number, which is the 130 billion, but if you use the 97 billion. The reason why that is important is the whole purpose of this exercise is because we can't pay the debt. So if you're only treating a small percentage of the problem, then the bigger problem remains. So that is the key issue at stake. That 85% participation rate, it's a good-looking number, but it doesn't reflect the reality of how much debt the government felt at the end of the program, not at the beginning. At the end of the program on 7th February was critical to be treated in order for the government to be able to continue to service its debt. That's the argument that we are making. Secondly, and this is very critical, and it's surprising that when this matter went to Parliament, parliamentarians did not dwell on this issue. Part of the reason the government has given for, or actually the full reason the government has given for reducing the amount of bonds it wants to treat or it wants to restructure from 130 billion to 97 billion is that first, they discovered eventually that some of the debt that they wanted to restructure was not actually valid for this exchange. But we only know that only the pension funds were explicitly said not to be valid for the exchange. Everybody else was invited to bring in the old debt and get new debt. So if that is the case, and we take out the pension funds out, that is around 9 billion or so out, we are still left with way more than 128 billion or something like that, not 97. So the government then comes up with a second reason, which is that some of the bonds have now changed to treasury bills. But if that is the case, we need to be told the terms. How it can't be that almost 40 billion have all been changed to treasury bills, because our current treasury bill volume is about 57 billion. If we add that to it, that would mean our treasury bills volumes is almost now 100 billion. So it must be a very small proportion of it, or at the very least, it's not the majority. Secondly, the treasury bills are more expensive because they have shorter duration. I mean, for the government, they have shorter duration and they have higher interest rate. So if we've done it in this way, and the current rate of treasury bills is what is being applied, then ultimately what we have now is a situation where we've increased the cost of borrowing for the government by almost 30 billion. So somebody has to explain very critically to us which bonds have been, how much of bonds have been converted to treasury bills, for whom, for what reason, what was the interest rate on the new treasury bills, and what is the duration? Because that would tell us that if we don't calculate it properly, it will mean that by the time the government ended the debt restructuring, it actually increases debt burden, not saved. Because if it's true by pure calculation that we have changed 40 billion of bonds into treasury bills, reduce the average tenor from about 3.5 years to 1 year, which is what a treasury bill must be under 1 year, and increase the average interest rate from about 19% to 35%, because that's the average interest rate today, then the new cost to the government is almost 30 billion. So the savings that the government has made in this scheme, which is around 12 billion or less, it's actually less than by the time that we conclude the transaction. We've actually have increased government debt servicing by almost 18 billion. That's very dangerous. And we see that now international media is scrambling to try and interpret this by trying to put the two numbers side by side. This is Reuters' latest report. People are confused, really confused. Last critical point. The debt restructuring can be, whether or not it was successful, can be assessed on two key parameters. One was how quickly it was done, and number two is how much relief government got. And if you've seen my analysis so far, it appears government did not get much relief. And that is not surprising because this is the debt restructuring we've seen in the world with the lowest participation rate. If you use the debt that government at the end of the exercise claimed it was treating, which is 7 February, 130 billion, you get a participation rate of around 63%, which is lower than what we've seen in the last 2 decades anywhere in the world. And the debt relief is very small. The positive side is that it was also the fastest we've seen in the world. So the government has traded speed for debt relief, and that's very, very, very critical. Why did the government not get a lot of participation rate? On the domestic scene, it didn't do consultations. It waited till 2nd December before it met the banks and told the banks its full plans. Everything that it did before did not involve the actual plans of what it wanted to do. So the consultation period from 2nd December, and then by 5th December, it had formally launched the program. Nobody has ever done that anywhere in the world. Even in Uruguay, which has had the fastest before Ghana, they spent 2 months discussing the plan and then launched the program, and then they spent 7 weeks in the program itself. The second critical point is that on the international front, some international investors hold our bonds. And that's, I think, in almost 20 billion or so. Those international investors, they needed roadshows. Our checks suggest that government pension funds like the government of Denmark pension fund, the government of Japan pension fund, were not even approached. They were not even discussed that this is what Ghana was doing. Meanwhile, we have signed deals with Citibank allowing our local debt to be sold internationally through global depository notes. So there are a lot of international investors, small-scale investors holding a few $1 million who were not even approached. There were no roadshows. There were a lot of funds that, as I've listed on my screen, that were not even approached. So we have a huge problem with the consultation, not only domestically, but internationally. So the last point, what does this mean going forward is basically whether or not the new bonds that have been issued will get a better rating. Because if the rating agencies do not change their mind and continue to maintain it at restricted default, the liquidity will be low regardless of whether you have an old bond or a new bond. And those who have the old bonds will do far better. And that is a very important point. Secondly, we have a critical issue because the 12 billion cedis or so that we've saved is far lower than the 52 billion or so interest rate that we are expecting this year alone. So, and next year we get even less relief because they front-loaded most of the benefits. What that means is that even if we get Eurobond relief about 50%, we still need about 2.5, and get the IMF money, we still need about $2.5 billion from somewhere. Most likely, this money must come from fiscal adjustment, cutting expenditure. The tax performance is so far not doing too well. We keep on going from crisis to crisis every 4 years, recycling a different type of crisis from this.
Okay, so did I lose Bright Simmons there? Hello, Bright, are you back?
Sorry, but when did you lose me?
Just that point. It's all right. So proceed. If you can
okay.
Wrap up in a minute.
So what I was saying was that we have got this chain of crisis where we change from fiscal crisis, that becomes a debt crisis. Then in time, it becomes a power crisis. Then it changes to a fiscal crisis. And it's been going on and on and on. This particular crisis should not be allowed to mutate. We must fix it at the core and we must fix it at the root. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bright. Now, Professor Bokwing, I've listened to you over the period. Now here we are. So it's Uhuru, is it?
I think the outcome of the domestic debt exchange is a reflection of the strategy government adopted. If you want more participation, that would inform the kind of approach that you needed to adopt. So we are not surprised. We are not surprised that we got it. But of course, I can also understand some level of adjustment to the universe of the base, that from the December 5th announcement, pensions were included, and that had been excluded. So almost 30 billion will be taken out. Then some kind of short-term swap arrangement Bank of Ghana does as part of
the pensions about 9 billion.
Okay, some kind of swap arrangement that
the pension is 30 billion actually. Just to put that. It's not my intent, but it's 30 billion.
But that's important. So, Prof,
yes,
Prof and Bright, have you heard?
Well, the minister then we have to go look at the CSD numbers, because that is not what it shows, the CSD numbers. So 30 billion,
yes,
okay, it's a matter that we'll discuss later.
Something I mentioned earlier, 30 billion.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Yes. So because I was working with some kind of data. Okay. So I'm always open to amend if that is not correct. And that is why when Bright interjected, I kept quiet.
Okay.
Okay, so you need to adjust that. Then there are also some swap arrangement as part of our international reserves management. They are usually short-term with underlying underlying debt, right? So if you are changing that to, let's say, a 15-year, that would disadvantage those holders. And perhaps the reason they saw the need to maybe convert it to treasury bills and all of that. But on the other hand, also, I lean towards Bright's argument that if you look at the interest rate and the proportion of treasury bill within this whole portfolio, we are almost at the point where we will arrive at a zero-sum game, right? If we are not careful in terms of what we want to achieve. So I lean towards Bright's position on that. My considered view is that if we are able to resolve this domestic debt exchange, and this is to treasury bill holders, and then also the external, and then we get the IMF program, everybody should know that the future of treasury bill will not be this high, okay, because that will create a distortion in the market. So there will be incentive on the part of the government to drag down the treasury bill rate. And that will not be so difficult to do, because it's not one day when it matures, government will be willing to roll it over at a much lower rate. And they need to do so quickly in order to give much backing to the tradability of the new bonds at much lower rates. Other than that, investors are rational.
But Prof, help me. How was this done? Conversion into treasury bill, and I only heard it at the end. If it was an opportunity available to individuals, I suppose I may have opted for that.
Yeah, my government needed to put. Look, Samson, I'm with you on that point, as well as Bright. Government needed to calm the market, and so they need to provide a lot more information. I don't want to share everything here, because the data I have and the volume involved here, I became a bit suspicious, okay? Whether maybe the more equals didn't take advantage of this and did something else. And given that this is Ghana, you rule out everything at your own expense, right? So I think that there would have to be the need for a bit more information. And the reason I've not been happy with this post-DD domestic debt exchange communication. It has been very poor. You know, government needed to adopt an approach that calms the market with greater information and transparency.
But the communication, many will say, has been rather reactionary or compelled. If you take the pensioner bondholders issue, and Justice Sophia Akufu's involvement and all.
Yes, and that has been a bit concerning for me. You know, we could have done this in the 80s and 90s, but now if you look at the composition of our debt stock, we are more open to market sentiments and all of that, and that will inform whatever strategy that we adopt. And Samson, I have personally been disappointed with the approach, okay, that we have adopted. And look, and it's not going to be that easy with external debt. And also, I blame the domestic debt holders because they were all looking for their individual interests. Talk about the Bankers Association and the rest of them. If we had formed a domestic creditor committee, we could have negotiated from position of strength and demanded a bit more information. Look, for the external creditors, they would demand the assumptions underlying the domestic debt sustainability analysis, validate it, and all of that. So it's not going to be that easy. It's not going to be that easy, but at least government walked away with the domestic debt, treated us as subjects whose only response was to comply. And of course, you can see what we are getting in here from that. So I think that we need to, that's why we said that government needed to present a comprehensive picture of the end game. What needs to come from fiscal adjustment, debt restructuring, structural, and all of that. That transparency would have helped the market and probably
fiscal adjustment, that aspect that you guys have been very disappointed about. Let me bring Dr.
Samson,
Dr. Kumar.
very quickly.
Yes.
Just before you go on, can both Prof and the Minister tell us whether the pension fund holdings they are describing is both treasury bills and bonds, or just bonds? Because my understanding, and I just double checked from CSD's data, is that the 9 billion is bonds. And so if it's 30 billion, that includes treasury bills. So that would be an important clarification going forward. But that's something we can always double check.
Dr. John Kumar, are you in a position to respond to this quickly before?
Oh, yes. It doesn't include T-bills. Is the value is 30 billion for pension funds. So he needs to check the source again.
All right. So government is happy at this moment, even though you are running against time. Now Parliament wants you to come over. How does it look going forward?
Yes, thank you very much, and good morning to listeners and panelists. I listened to the presentation by Bright Simmons, and I'm happy that Professor Bobkin corrected the figure. I think that is the basis for the analysis he did, which I disagree. In fact, the 5th December figure he gave of 137 billion was correct, but because of the delays, by the time we got to 7th February, it has reduced to 130 billion because some settlements have been done. And then the eligible bondholders, that is what we talked about, the 97.7 billion. The difference between that is the 30 billion for the pension funds, not 9 billion, it's 30 billion. And then, so you're supposed to get 100 billion. And then we did the exchange rate financing policy, the swap. That is what you are talking about, those who got the T-bills. These are short-term exchange rate financing policy of the Bank of Ghana that could not have been converted into 5-year bonds. So that amount is 2 billion, not 40 billion as presented by Bright Simmons. So those are the figures that I think he should look at in his analysis. So on the whole, I agree that maybe a different approach could have been adopted, but I think that government is grateful to all domestic bondholders for their contribution and acceptance to be part of the program, to the Bankers Association, the labor unions, individual bondholders, and everybody who has played a very vital role in this process. We are very grateful. We must also remember that we had a target going forward. I mean, Bright raised issues about other loans and bonds and commitment that has to be paid beyond the treasury bonds. We must know that government set a target after the debt sustainability analysis. And we targeted that by 2028, we should bring the debt levels to 55%. And so that has been the basis, the picture for where all this engagement has been running from. And so in all the analysis, we believe that if we are able to deal specifically with this group of debts, or I mean the bonds, we'll be able to hit the target asset with all parties involved as the at the 55% by 2028 and that kind of thing. So we believe that we are on course. Of course, we should be open to market sentiments, advice from Professor Bobkin. And so all these things that we are doing, we are taking some of these concerns on board so that at the end of the day, the market is able to see the 30 billion pension funds that we were taking out. You know, government agreed with the pension and labor unions to take that out for a different treatment. So it's not going to be part of the domestic debt exchange. But I know engagement is still ongoing to see how best we can make it beneficial to all parties involved and even bring greater benefits.
The individual bondholders have not been excited that government has defaulted on, maturing, bonds, and actually Fitch cites that as one of the reasons for its ratings that it has brought out recently. Hello, John. John's line is frozen. I hope that we're able to establish contact with him again back quickly. But the government said that it had made approximately 85% of holders of eligible. Yes. Yes, John?
Okay. So that issue is a problem of communication. Something in the memorandum that we put out, we stated in it that once the DDE was in the process, we could not be settling maturities until we are fully completed. So we want to fully assure all bondholders who have due maturities that they are going to be settled ASAP. By the grace of God, we have come to the end of the process. And once settlement is done, all the due maturities will be paid in the shortest possible time. So it's been already communicated, except that I think it has not been clear to bondholders.
Right.
So they are going to
there's been mounting pressure to do more than the focus on, debt restructuring, the manner in which you are doing it, including, cutbacks and so on. Professor Bokwing mentioned that a while ago. There's very little heard about that from the government.
It is true. One concern that we've heard a lot about fiscal adjustment, further expenditure cuts, and government has already announced about 36 measures in the 2023 budget on expenditure measures that will seek to bring down expenditures going forward. But I think beyond that, people want to see much more commitment on the part of government. Going forward, those are cabinet policy directions that will be announced very soon as part of our program. So we also want to assure that government has their eyes on it. And
how was the conversion to, as it were, treasury bills? How was it done? So that some people feel disadvantaged. Because when I went to my bank, if I knew about this and it was available to me, I would have opted for that.
No, it wasn't available to you.
Why?
These are not bonds that were raised for budget support. These are Special Bank of Ghana exchange rate financing policy. That is short term. So it's a special instrument. And it's only those who are on that qualified to be on this, because the minimum we are getting on the new bonds is 5 years. So if somebody has a short-term arrangement with you within 1 year for you to return his facility, you cannot take it into 5-year bonds. That is why the conversion was done to T-bills. So it wasn't.
Who are those who are on such a special, arrangement for bonds you talk about?
Yeah, our central bank has arrangement with other central banks and to sometimes exchange and of course other partners to sometimes take forex in the short term for business and also to repay within a certain period. So those arrangements are always there within the Bank of Ghana and other central banks.
Okay. Yes, Felix.
Yes, Samson.
Yes.
You know, you listen to these numbers, and if you are not careful, you would miss the entire point of what is under discussion here. These numbers represent pain and suffering for people who bought government bonds in the hope that government will keep its word and that when the time was due, they will be paid their interest on which they live and on which their sustenance is based. And that when time also falls due, they will be paid their principals. Now, as we speak, these people have been compelled to forfeit those interest payments that they were looking forward to, and the principals that I'm sure they had planned their lives and expenditure for this year and subsequent years around. So even as we recite and have these numbers roll off our tongues, we must remember what they mean. It means that pensioners, some of whom went out to demonstrate, it means that individual bondholders, it means that financial institutions have lost significant amounts of money that they had planned their lives around. Indeed, there are financial institutions that look forward to the proceeds of these bonds to constitute about 70% of their annual revenue. And if a financial institution does not receive 70% of its annual revenue in one particular year, you can imagine what will happen to that institution. There are people who have to incur some expenditure. They have to pay fees for their awards. Some of them have to depend on these monies to buy medications for themselves. They have chronic diseases. Some of them are in their old age. Some, I'm sure, do not have any breadwinners. Some may not be married or their husbands may be dead. They may not even have children. And so this is how they live. So when the government comes telling you or celebrates the fact that they have achieved 80% compliance rate for this domestic debt exchange, you must appreciate what they have done to the people of this country.
We certainly are not oblivious of
Absolutely.
that. And as I mentioned to him, you hear me put myself in
that position. Exactly.
Okay,
exactly.
Yes, because I am one of those numbers.
Well, exactly. So you feel it perhaps better than myself.
Now, I've had to lead clients to go to insurance companies to talk about claims, among others, deal in banks. And it is very obvious that the situation is really bad. Exactly. But that's where we are, and we are supposed to burden share, according to the finance.
But there's no such burden sharing. Indeed, the posturing of this government does not suggest that they even appreciate what they have put people through. 2 days ago, the finance minister was in parliament asking us to rejoice in the Lord for bringing us to this juncture. It means that he, Alhaji Bawumia, who is supposed to be the head of our economic management team and the president, have buried themselves in a delusional bubble. They don't appreciate what they have done. Indeed, if we were a country where honor was an important factor in our national lives, these people would have been long gone. Alhaji Bawumia would have left, or he would have been fired as head of the economic management team. The finance minister would have been fired. Indeed, it would not be far-fetched to even suggest that the president himself would have resigned for ensuring or supervising such an economic catastrophe. And you see, it is not that they did not know that we will get to this juncture. Samson, as I speak to you, from a position where we owed about 120 billion Ghana cedis in 2017, and indeed, I urge everybody to go and read President Akufo-Addo's maiden State Orientation Address sometime in March 2017, and see how he spoke ill about the previous administration because we had left a debt of 120 billion Ghana cedis. Today, our debt is in excess of 600 billion Ghana cedis, if you account for SOE debts and SPV debts, like Dachin, Esla, Sino Hydro, and the likes. It is because of this that we have had to go through this very, very painful measure. And it is not as though when they were getting here, they were not warned. They told us that they had capacity to manage the economy. Indeed, they were even hiding some of our debts at a time when red flags were appearing that we are nearing a danger zone. Even when we had some time right after the elections in 2020 to take some quick action to avert this catastrophe, they allowed amateurish politicking, and I'm being blunt today because the suffering that you and others are going through requires bluntness at this stage. They were amateurish in their politicking. Look, by the first quarter of 2021, it was obvious that we had to go to the IMF. The minority warned them. Civil society organizations warned them. Academics like Professor Bobkin and co. warned them. But they refused. And the reason why they refused was just so that you and I could not ever say that an Akufo-Addo government went to the IMF, because there was no logical, economic, or financial reason to data. So they went to the IMF so late that the only way that the IMF could touch us with a long pole was to have our debt reduced. And we are talking of some 300 billion Ghana cedis that has to be chopped off our debt because they have to get to a debt GDP ratio of 55%. And no country in recent years has had to do such a drastic debt reduction. Sri Lanka, which has become the reference point for a basket case in terms of economic management, did 28% debt reduction. But we are having to do 45%, and which runs into about 300 billion Ghana cedis if you look at our entire debt profile. At the same time, this government is not showing any intent that, one, they will take responsibility. They continue to blame factors that are not responsible for this situation. In addition to this, the president has even refused to heed calls to downsize government. Look, I have here the document that they sent to Parliament last year that details the number of staff, not staffers, at the presidency. They have a total of 337 political appointees. Samson, what do we need 337 political appointees in addition to over 680 public and civil servants at the presidency for? And most of these people don't have any functional necessity. They have such bizarre positions as the overseer of the National Cathedral. There's somebody they call a policy associate. And they have all manner of party activists who they describe as technical advisors who do nothing beyond sitting on social media and abusing people who criticize government. And it's not as though President Akufo-Addo is oblivious of the fact that this is adding cost to the running of government. He knows it. Why, at a point, he decided that he needed 125 ministers. That is reckless mismanagement of the public purse. And when you do that, you will fall into this trap. But one would have thought that even if he was obstinate 4 years, 5 years ago, in the heart of a massive crisis like this, he would take steps that show that he empathizes with the suffering that you and other bondholders are going through.
He stopped flying private jets.
But he should not have even flown those private jets. In all, it cost us about 36 million Ghana cedis
So
for
he
him to fly those
appreciates
private
where we are.
Listen, it is far too little. Far too little. He should not have done it. Why? He stood on a public platform and told us that his biggest priority as a president was the construction of a $450 million cathedral. As I speak to you, there are over 800,000 Ghanaian school children who do not have access to desks to sit on. For 4 years running, this government has not printed one textbook that reflects the new curricula that they themselves introduced. Only last week, school feeding caterers were on their necks demanding payments. They owe contractors over 10 billion Ghana cedis that they are unable to pay. Yet, this government believes that it must keep up to 337 political appointees at the presidency and build a cathedral. They spent 400 million Ghana cedis building or digging the most expensive hole in the history of the world. And as I speak to you, look at the amorphous organizations they've created. Only recently, I saw that they had created something they call a Ghana Petroleum Hub Development Authority. We want to, buy ambulances for the Ministry of Health and dig boreholes and build classroom blocks. So we create a special development initiative secretariat. The Ministry of Trade has been supervising the establishment of factories since God knows when. But this government believes that we need a one district, one factory to do that. These assemblies have been building classroom blocks, boreholes, KVIPs, and what have you. But they must create 3 or 4 development authorities with a raft of CEOs and deputy CEOs just to whittle away public funds to satisfy public activists. They are showing absolutely no commitment to doing this. Indeed, they should have done these things even before they came to you and other bondholders to agree to forfeit the interest that was due you, that you had planned your lives around. So they are showing no responsibility. They are demonstrating no empathy. They do not think that the people of Ghana even deserve an apology for the terrible mismanagement. Indeed, I say distraction of the Ghanaian economy.
Justice Sufakfu, sort of emphasized this point on the first day of joining the picketing. The point is that we believe that we must be moving on.
Yes, but Samson, you see, we cannot move on. And you see, you and other bondholders, about 1.3 million or so of you, cannot move on at a time when the government is not moving on. If the president does not recognize that, first of all, he must punish those who brought you here. He does not recognize that he must match the sacrifice that you are making with credible,
the reason I was bringing in this was that
expenditure cuts.
You
cannot move on.
The minority of your party in parliament are now insisting that there must be approvals in Parliament.
Yes.
And we know that the IMF board, they have their spring meeting, is it? And the thing is to hurry, be able to catch them in good time. Otherwise, we worsen our situation.
The process cannot be short-circuited. You see, the reason why that scrutiny is important is that you and other bondholders must be protected. The Ghanaian economy must be protected from the recklessness, impunity, and sometimes lawlessness of this government. Even as they got into this crisis, what have we witnessed? That the Bank of Ghana flagrantly violated Section 36 of the Bank of Ghana Act and has given this government up to 45 billion Ghana cedis illegally without recourse to Parliament. So if Parliament does not ensure that their oversight responsibility is undertaken, if they don't carry out scrutiny, more economic
we are not in normal times. As Bryce Simon shows us for a second time. Bryce Simon shows us for a second time. Ghana has spent 2.2 months doing this. Elsewhere, they have done up to about 33 months, 17 months in getting people around this. But we don't have the time.
For people who even
the minister has indicated to us, and all the economists have suggested, of course, not all the economists, because some disagree, that this economy will collapse if we don't get the IMF
First of all, they had all the time
approval.
They had all the time to take the steps that needed to be taken to avert this. Number two, for a government that even in normal times likes to act with lawlessness and impunity, the last thing you want to do is to give them a carte blanche, citing crisis. Even in times of crisis, there is a need for scrutiny so that people do not do things that come to harm us further down the line. So I don't think that taking relevant documents, appropriate legislation and bills and programs to Parliament for scrutiny over a number of days is going to crash this economy. They have already crashed the economy with their recklessness and mismanagement. And we should not give a further stamp of approval to more recklessness by turning the blind. So I do not buy the time argument.
Let me bring back Bright. And Bright, Dr. Richmond Akwesi Echuahene, has a paper where he uses the 9 billion for the pension funds, and he's also using the same source. I just checked with him, and he confirms to me. He says, please, from the CSD, the pension fund was 9 billion, not 30 billion. Is CSD misinforming and misreporting? Bryce Simmons is correct with the 9 billion for pension funds. There is no record of the 30 billion in the CSD website. So what do you think is happening, Bright?
Yes, I think it's very confusing, but two very important points. One is that all along, there's been public analysis, there's been pension reports, there's been a lot of back and forth around the breakdown and composition of Ghana's debt. And everybody had assumed that the pension funds hold less than 7% of bonds. The assets under management up to 2021, which is I think the last date, the last data of which I'm aware, was about around 30-something billion. So it would be surprising that they are holding of bonds, because they have to invest in a diversified base, and a lot of it has to be government security, but they will split between the treasury bills, which have higher yield, etc. But the key point is this: while there's now a dispute about whether we can trust the central depository, which is where all the information is, versus the government's data, and I completely concede that this is baffling, because everybody in the world have been using this number, that the pension bonds hold this amount. But I understand that there's now a dispute, so we'll put that aside. Whatever be the case, when the government went out to restructure its debt, it should have known. I think you cannot dispute that, right? It should have known what the distribution of debt is, and which is eligible and which is not eligible. The argument is that as late as 7th February, the prospectus that the government issued to investors, inviting them to tender, listed all the bonds that were eligible, 67 or so bonds that were eligible, and the total amount outstanding in each of those bonds that they want investors to bring in so they can give them new debt. On that 7th of February, that prospectus I showed you said 130 billion. You cannot then, at the end of the exercise, claim that that debt was not eligible. So, because it concludes only in one of two ways. Either the government is so sloppy that he doesn't know the eligible debt going into the process, even at the end of it, or the claim that we've made that the eligible debt to 130 billion is valid. I don't see how you wriggle out of it. If they had made the change on 7 February, when they made the last amended prospectus, I would have understood and I would have backed down. But where it's the case that on 7th of February, when you were issuing the last amended or revised prospectus, you had 130 billion as the eligible debt. We must calculate the participation rate based on that eligible debt. And if we do, we can come to no other conclusion that it's around 64%. But that is not the most critical point. The most critical point is that it then suggests that the amount of debt you were able to restructure is low, which means, therefore, that the amount of debt relief you will get, which we estimate to be in the region of about 12 billion cedis thereabout, is also low. So the government must now tell us where it will get the remaining amount of money, because we know it's about 52 billion cedis in terms of how much interest it has to service. If you've got only 12 billion from here, where do you get the rest? And I think that you can only come to 2 conclusions. We are far from done in terms of this attempt to get to debt sustainability.
Oh, really?
And if I agree with the opposition leader in your studio that we should not create the impression that this is some kind of major breakthrough. It's not. The big challenge is still ahead of us, and we are going to see more of these kind of restructuring attempts in order to be able to get to a range within which we are not spending 60% of our revenues on debt.
Right.
They will have to cut significant expenditures quickly, else we are not going anywhere fast.
Okay. Professor Bokwing, you were saying that for the external debt restructuring process, they will demand and will receive sufficient enough information, and they will probe the assumptions. Is that to suggest that what has been done locally, you don't trust the assumptions?
No, the government took us for granted and we allowed it. So we didn't negotiate from position of strength. Okay. So we couldn't push government to get sufficient information. Government kept so much to its chest. And you see it showing up here. Okay. And that is why I said that when the figure of 9 billion was mentioned, I kept quiet because I had seen that figure. I had worked with that figure. But trying to recalculate and get into a certain point, I had to go behind and find out other things, what happened, including the swap arrangement and all of that. Okay. So as I said, I'm hoping if it turns out to be this and we adjust, because of course we know in part, we prophesy in part. Okay?
So we are far from done.
No, we are not. Look, and I agree with Bright, and I will say that there is no way Ghana can achieve the debt sustainability cutoff of 55% in present value terms by 2028. It's impossible. We cannot. Let's not deceive ourselves. And I think that, and here, I will not put the blame solely on government. I think the IMF itself ought to contextualize their framework that by 2028, that will be too difficult for us, especially given the approach and the strategy government has adopted.
Professor Bokwing, I know that you belong to the Christian Advocate Group. Nothing is impossible in the sight of God, right?
Not when we have these leaders in place.
Oh, I see.
Okay, so,
right.
And I think that
we have to rejoice.
This whole thing is to generate some level of confidence, but we are missing it out. If you look at the technical committee that was put together at the ministry when the individual bondholders started pushing, and you look at the quantification of the fiscal savings, both revenue and expenditure, we're looking at something in excess of 80 billion. So you see, there's greater room to reach debt sustainability faster through fiscal adjustment, heavily based on expenditure cuts, and that will not affect growth.
Okay.
At the end of the day, we should be looking at the end picture. What do we want to achieve? We want to do all of this so that we can return to inclusive growth. But the approach government has adopted would not lead to that. Because, for instance, if you look at the liquidity losses to the banks alone, it's more than 6 billion. That would affect the credit lending to the private sector. If you look at the haircut on households, private sector and all of that. But if we cut this expenditure, they will not affect growth. They will rather free up space for growth-enhancing spending. And something, as we are talking about this, inflation came down marginally, January, 51.6%. Remember, inflation in Cote d'Ivoire is less than 5%. Of course, they have just 32 ministers. You count the number of ministers we have in Ghana. So it tells you that, and look, there is empirical
but Prof, that argument with the number of ministers, well, there are people who have said that the optics is also important to show that you appreciate, as in if you reduce the numbers of ministers, it is also important that it will show the public that you appreciate what is going on. But we are told that what you get is not any substantial. If you do,
it's not just the ministers. You are looking at the overall government size agencies. Look, if you look at from 2017, multiple agencies that have been created, some actually have no value to be in existence.
Okay.
But they are sustained, budgetary allocation and all of that. So if you put all these things together, there's practically no space. And if we are not careful, we'll finish this debt restructuring. In less than 2 years, we'll come back to the table again.
John, are you at government with the impression that this is done and dusted?
Well, this is an ongoing process. We want to thank Ghanaians for the support on the successful completion of domestic debt exchange program. I will encourage Bright to confirm the 30 billion figure of the pension funds, just for him to be sure. And we also want to assure Ghanaians that all the concerns that have been raised in terms of fiscal adjustment that have to be done in response to the current circumstances, government has its eyes on it, and at the right time, the necessary announcement to be made. I know my brother Felix in the studio is ranting and trying to do politics and take advantage of the difficult situation. Unfortunately, where we stand now, it is not time to do a blame game.
Oh, so, but he's speaking about matters that ordinary people are talking about.
I know,
did you hear Justice Sofia Kufu?
For years.
The expectation of what you should do, cut down. You admitted that a while ago.
I responded to that those are the fiscal adjustment requests which will be responded to. But he should remember that in the absence of COVID, he left Ghana with Dumso. He could not even solve Dumso in 5 years in his incompetence. The kind of incompetent government that they led us.
That's another argument that I have taken, MPP communicators through this on this show. At a later date, we can debate that. But the records will show that the NDC had dealt with Dumso before you took over.
Absolutely.
They couldn't. The record will show that they couldn't deal with
if they had inherited Dumso, given their hopelessness and incompetence, we'll still be in darkness. We don't have capacity to solve any problem.
All right.
In the short time. But you see, today is not a good day to engage in such engagement.
Of course,
that's right.
And so let me just take opportunity to thank all those who sacrificed and agreed to be part of this process, and to assure them that government is sensitive to the issues, and we are going to respond at the right time on the necessary fiscal adjustments as well.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank
Samson,
you.
A very quick point to say that even if the pension bonds as funds were taken out, that is still non-participation. So you still have to adjust your participation rate to reflect the outcome. The fact that they didn't take part is non-participation.
Yes.
So if you intended initially for them to take part, they didn't take part, you still cannot use that to get a higher participation rate.
All right.
It's not mathematically possible.
Okay. Thank you very much, gentlemen. We have had Bright Simmons, Honorary Vice President, Imani Africa. Godfred A. Bokping is Professor of Finance and Economist, University of Ghana. Dr. John Ampuntia Kuma is MP Ejusu and Deputy Minister of Finance. And Felix Kwachiofosu is former Deputy Communications Minister and NDC parliamentary candidate for Ebura Asebu Kwaman Kese. And my outfit, as always, is by Habil Scooter. You can find them at Ajiringano Gates. You could also call 0200 84 1988. 0200 84 1988. Thank you very much for joining us, and have a good afternoon, God willing. Next week, we bring you another commanding edition of the Newsfile.